Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special edition of IPA Encounters with Professor Ian Plimer. My name is John Roscombe. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs. I am speaking to you from the Baillieu Maya Media Studio in Melbourne, and Professor Plimer is coming to us from the offices of Connor Court Publishing in Brisbane. Today, we'll be talking with Professor Plimer about his new book, Green Murder, a life sentence of net zero with no parole. I'm going to introduce Ian in a moment. I'm going to talk about Ian's glittering career, and then we'll be discussing the book, what motivated Ian to write the book, what are the key lessons for us in Australia at the moment, and what does the debate about climate change say about the condition of our country. IPA Encounters is brought to you by IPA members and supporters. We can only have discussions with people like Professor Plimer with your support. Let me now say a few words about Professor Plimer before we hear from Ian. Professor Ian Plimer is Australia's best known geologist. He is Emeritus Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Melbourne, where he was the Professor and Head of Earth Sciences from 1991 to 2005, after serving at the University of Newcastle and as Head of Geology at the University of Adelaide. He was also at the German Research Foundation as Professor at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Ian has published more than 120 scientific papers on geology and was one of the trinity of editors of the 5-volume Encyclopedia of Geology. This is Ian's 11th book for the general public. Some of his best known books are, of course, Telling Lies for God in 1994, A Short History of Planet Earth, published by the ABC in 2000. Of course, Heaven and Earth, How to Get Expelled from School, Not for Greens, and Climate Change Delusion and the Great Electricity Ripoff, all published by Connor Court. This book, as Ian says, is that of a scientist, and it's been a labour of love and hate, unfunded by third parties. Ian is the winner of numerous prizes and medals, including the Clark Medal from the Royal Society of New South Wales, the Sir Willis Connolly Medal from the Australasian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. He was the Australian Humanist of the Year. He was a winner of the Eureka Prize and a winner of the Centenary Medal. Very significantly, Ian has spent much of his life in the rough and tumble of the town of Broken Hill. He's a patron of Lifeline Broken Hill and the Broken Hill Geo Centre. He's worked for North Broken Hill Limited, has been a consultant to many mining companies and the director of many exploration companies. In his post-university career, Ian is proudly the director of a number of various unlisted private Hancock prospecting companies. Importantly, a new Broken Hill mineral, Plimerite, was named after Ian in recognition of his contribution to Broken Hill geology. As Ian says, ironically, Plimerite is green and soft. It fractures unevenly, is brittle, and is insoluble in alcohol. I first got to know Professor Plimer in 2009 when the IPA had the privilege of launching Heaven and Earth, which has since gone on to sell tens of thousands of copies. I've had the privilege of travelling with Ian around Australia. There would not be a geology student or geologist working today that Ian does not know or does not know of. One of my fondest memories was with Ian at the Isa Hotel in Mount Isa some years ago, as we were having a drink after a public lecture, and from across the public bar, miner in a high-vis vest said, "Ian, I'm taking down heaven and earth into the pit to tell my mates. Ian, it is a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for everything you do. Please tell us how you came to write Green Murder, a life sentence of net zero with no parole.
Well, John, it's very simple. I've had a gutful. I've had a gutful of the Greens telling lies. I've had a gutful of the Greens frightening children. I've had a gutful of Green schemes that will send this country bankrupt. I've had a gutful of the Greens trying to take the high moral ground, because they don't. Their policies end up in people losing prosperity, people dying, the environment being ruined, and people having no hope. So we on the Conservative side, I think, have got more manners and a little bit more gentle. And those on the side of the left are not. So I thought, well, no, it's time to play their game. And this book is brutal, and it's meant to be. It's a full frontal challenge of the Greens, who I think lack morality. And they cannot use any moral argument, because this book attacks every moral argument and tears them down.
Ian, as you were writing the book, what struck you about the debate over the last few years? You've been in the middle of the discussion of the science of climate change, of geology, of the atmosphere. Have things changed in the last few years that motivated you to write the book as you have?
Yes, they have. There's never been a debate. There's not been a debate in the scientific circles. There's not been a debate in public, and things have changed. We are being cancelled. Those who are trying to have a rational view of the planet are being cancelled. There are many newspapers now that will not take opinion articles, will not take letters. There are many people who just say, oh no, the science is settled, we don't need to discuss this matter. So things have changed. We have become much more fundamentalist in the approach to a system of nature, which is absolutely awe-inspiring, yet people want to focus on one poor little innocent molecule called carbon dioxide. And, that's just not right. It doesn't work like that.
Can I take you to the book? It's 600 pages, if you don't mind me saying so. It's magisterial. I learned so much from it. It covers so many topics around science, geology, climate, false predictions, psychology, politics, the Greens themselves, renewable energy, all of which we'll be talking about this evening. We've received something like 150 questions. I'm not going to be able to ask all of those questions of you tonight. So what I've done is I've defined a few key themes for you. Can we begin talking about the book by asking you, Ian, in your view, what is the role of humans in the climate?
Humans have changed the weather, and in some areas due to massive land clearing, a good example would be Mount Kilimanjaro, the local climate has been changed. We are yet to see evidence that human activity has changed the global climate. I don't argue that humans have no effect whatsoever on the surface of the planet. We have had an effect, and we must have an effect, but we are part of the biosphere like so many other animals, and we leave our mark. But there's one key scientific point. No one has ever shown that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming. Now, if someone did show that, then you'd have to show that the bulk of the emissions, and that's 97% of the emissions which are natural, you'd have to show that those emissions don't drive global warming. So the whole concept of global warming is actually underpinned by a falsity.
Can you then explain, Ian, how we've got to this fixation on CO2 as 400 parts per million, and that is driving the climate? Where has that idea come from, that this relatively small proportion or very small proportion of CO2 in the atmosphere is driving all of this rapid change?
Well, I think it's come from a long way back, and I think it's come as an anti-industrial push, because any industry that is smelting or mining or transporting or making things or creating food emits carbon dioxide. So it's a proxy for industry. It's a way to attack industry. And then we citizens are using energy, and it's a way to rein us in and to attack us. So I think it's never been a scientific argument. It's always been a political argument, and it's always been an argument about control. It has nothing to do with climate. It has nothing to do with science. It has nothing to do with the environment, but it's got everything to do with control by unelected bureaucrats somewhere in the world trying to control everything we do. And it took off with the scientists seeing that there was a great pool of money here. Now, I remember when I worked on the Australian Research Council, and I was also on the German and Swedish research councils, and there was a fight against cancer. And if you could show in your research grant application that ingrown toenails were related to cancer, you would get funding. Now, that's exactly the same now. If you can argue that wearing out the soles of your shoes is related to climate change, you will get funded. And the funding models are based on chasing the preferred fad and fashion of the day. The problem is that these fads and fashions end up being fraudulent. And we've been able to get into this position in the Western world because we're wealthy. We don't have to worry about where our next feed comes from. I spend a lot of my geological life working in the third world. People don't care about climate. They want to eat. They want to have their kids have an education. They want to have some electricity so they can have a warm meal. They can be warmed at night. Their kids can have an electric light so they can do their homework, so they can advance in life. This is very much a Western phenomenon. We are so wealthy, we don't have to worry about very much at all. And we get into an absolute lather about various natural processes which we know nothing about.
Can I then ask you, Ian, about the natural processes? And we've had many questions about this, and you talk about this in the first chapter. The question of the relationship between CO2 and temperature. Could you talk a little bit about, does temperature follow CO2, or does CO2 increases follow temperature?
Well, we are getting told that as you increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that forces temperature to rise. Now, we've got some wonderful science, and it's a law called the Beer-Lambert law. I prefer to call it the Beer law, where as you increase atmospheric carbon dioxide, you will get a temperature increase. But the temperature increase is really due to the first 100 parts per million. We're 4 times that now. And what happens is every time we increase carbon dioxide or double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it has virtually no effect on temperature. But what we do find is when we measure ice cores and measure the bits of trapped air in the ice from when the snow was falling and it trapped air and then froze to ice, there are various chemical fingerprints in the ice and in the air where we can work out what the temperature was, and we can work out what the atmospheric carbon dioxide was. So the very first measurement showed a perfect correlation between increasing temperature and increasing carbon dioxide. But on a much finer scale, every time temperature increased, we had an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere some 650 to 1600 years later. So what it's showing is, yes, there is a relationship between temperature and carbon dioxide. Every time the temperature rises, later the carbon dioxide rises. And it's not the carbon dioxide causing the temperature rise, it's a natural temperature rise causing the carbon dioxide rise.
Can you talk a little bit about that natural temperature rise? Because in the book, there's a very interesting discussion about the role of where the world gets its energy from, namely the sun. Why has the role of the sun been so discounted?
Well, the role of the sun has been discounted because the sun has cycles. We can see these cycles, they're recorded in history, they go back in time. And for some really odd reason, that great ball of heat up there in the sky actually provides us with energy. Now, that great ball of heat also is variable, so the amount of energy hitting us is variable, and carbon dioxide doesn't provide us with heat. This is a fallacy. But what is totally ignored is the role of clouds, that quite often energy can't get through or is bounced back into space from clouds. And we do not understand clouds. And because we don't understand clouds, we don't really understand very much about climate. And because we don't understand the clouds, our climate models don't work. I also go into the book into another source of heat, and that is our planet is cooling down. That heat's got to go somewhere. The thickest crust on the Earth is on the continents. The thinnest is in that 70% of the planet covered by the oceans. And we put a lot of heat into the oceans. These are from the 28,000 kilometres of mid-ocean ridges where we've got active volcanoes. These are from the 3,400 volcanoes on the ocean floor. We've got 1,511 volcanoes that we can see, and there's millions of them on the ocean floor. Not only are these releasing heat into the oceans, but they're releasing carbon dioxide. That doesn't bubble through to the surface. It dissolves in the cold ocean waters that are quite saline and under pressure, and later that is released. And this is why most of our natural emissions of carbon dioxide come from the ocean. So the whole models and concepts which we're getting hammered with in the public are demonstrably wrong. Carbon dioxide doesn't heat the planet, it's the sun. We don't know about how much heat comes from below or how much carbon dioxide comes below. And I find it quite arrogant for people to have models which we know don't work based on unknown unknowns, and yet many of the known features which can change the surface temperature are totally ignored.
Ian, why then are scientists so certain? Why do they say we know more than we do?
Certainty and science don't go together. The sign of a good scientist is one who will say, I don't know, who is uncertain, who might see a phenomenon and say, that's interesting, I might follow that one up. There is no certainty in science, but we can have degrees of confidence. But I think with so many people so certain about this, I think you've got to look at it from another angle. It's a case of follow the money. Many of these people are unemployable. Many of these people can only work in universities, CSIRO, Bureau of Meteorology, and if they didn't have a job there, they'd have no job. And so to exploit fear, which is a very, very important thing to do, fear is something which drives a lot of human action, to exploit that gives you research grants, it gives you time for a career, and a large number of these people, when they retire, they then change sides. So and it's following the money.
One of the things that I enjoy so much in the book is the discussion of predictions, and I'm going to read out a couple because they're so interesting, and you've got a wonderful compendium of every wrong prediction going back to the 4th or 5th century. Can I preface the discussion about wrong predictions by asking you, why is it that we seem so eager to predict the end of the world? And as you say beautifully at the beginning of one of the chapters, if any one of these predictions that the doomsayers had made were right, we wouldn't be here. What is it about human nature that wants us to predict the end of the world?
I think we're hardwired for the end of the world. I think this is a fundamental evolutionary survival mechanism where there's a big grizzly bear about to get you and it's behind you. You've got to constantly live in fear. You've got to be very much aware that you can disappear very, very quickly. So I think it's very human to be fearful. I think it's very human to be concerned about the end of the world. I think it's very human to be aware that we are mortal and we might shuffle off before our time because of something that hits us. Now, once we intertwine that with Christianity, then you can have guilt, you can have redemption, you can basically follow the new green religion, which is a new religion but without history and without religion, but it has its indulgences, and we must pay for those indulgences with our higher electricity bills and our higher costs, which we see with creeping inflation today. So I think it's very human to be frightened, which gets exploited. I think it's very human to worry about getting wiped out, and that gets exploited. And so all the charlatans for thousands of years that I've shown in the book can make a living out of frightening people.
I'm going to, Ian, mention some of the very best predictions and some of my favourite predictions, and I'm going to ask you to comment on them. So, of course, you mentioned Paul Ehrlich, who in 1970 famously said, population will inevitably and completely outstrip whatever small increases in food supplies we make, and the death rate will increase until at least 100 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death within 10 years. He said that in 1970. You quote George Wald, the Nobel Prize winner for medicine, who in 1970 said, civilization will end within 15 or 20 years unless immediate action is taken against the problems facing mankind. There's a wonderful discussion about the ice ages of the 1970s and the discussion about the looming glaciers that are going to overtake the Western world. You comment that in 1970, there was a letter to the US president from a number of academics at Brown University who said, 42 of us believe that the global deterioration of climate was an order of magnitude larger than experienced by civilized mankind, and they were predicting the Great Ice Age. You were talking about the CIA saying that, in fact, the world is safer when the world is hotter. Then, of course, you go on to Tim Flannery and the discussions that he got so wrong. And I'll just give you one, and I'll ask you to speak to it. As you said, in 2008, Tim Flannery said famously, even the rain that falls isn't actually going to fill our dams or our river system. And then in the book you write, in November 2020, the main dam supplying Sydney with potable water was 98.1% full. Why have we been so reluctant to hold to account people who make these predictions that are so wrong?
We don't hold them to account because I think the media loves these stories of doom and death. I think Paul Ehrlich is one of the many death cultists around who are predicting the end by gruesome means. And instead of starvation, we now have food for 10 billion people, yet we have 7.7 billion on the planet. The planet is a far better place than it ever was. Flannery is never held to question. No one ever asks him the key questions. He will not debate me, like many of those on the climate catastrophist side. And any of us on this call who are in Eastern Australia, I've been here in Queensland for a week and a half, and it has been bucketing. And that's been happening in most of Eastern Australia. The dams are not full, they're overflowing. So I think it takes a very stupid or brave person to make those sort of predictions, yet they are. So why would you do it? Well, you might do it to... if you're narcissistic, you might do it because your job requires you to keep money flowing in. I'm surprised that the journalists don't ask searching questions. And that leads me to believe that pretty well all of our journalists in the mainstream media are unquestioning. They are actually beating the drum of climate change and doom and gloom, and that they don't particularly want to question the narrative at all. So Flannery can get away with it.
Ian, you're passionate about science and the role that science can play to improve the community and society. When did science journalism, science writing turn from a discussion of science to political barracking, which is what we see now?
I think it started with the anti-nuclear protests, and it's got even louder in the barracking. And it has continued with climate. It is now very loud with COVID, and science presents numerous views on a phenomenon. And I've experienced this at many conferences where you have your cliques and groups going around and making disparaging comments about that group there or that group there. This is the way science works. It's cultic in many ways, and there is not one view in science. And yet the press wants to have one view, and people like me get cancelled. Well, that's fine. Ultimately, the data wins. And science advances one funeral at a time. And so I hope I live long enough to see a lot of funerals and to see a change in the science. So science is contaminated by people wanting media exposure. So the media is contaminated by wanting to follow a catastrophist narrative which sells, and the media express their political view. They don't disparagingly look at the science, and that's been happening for a long period of time.
The first part of the book is about science and climate, and a large part of the second half is about the consequences of science policy and climate change policy. There's a lot of discussion, wonderful discussion about energy policy. Can you talk a little about what the Western world is doing to its energy policies? And then I'll ask you about what is China doing?
In my life, we had very little energy when I was young. We then had abundant, cheap, reliable coal-fired electricity and cheap petroleum, even though we didn't produce much in Australia. And now apparently that energy is deemed as dirty because the product from combustion is carbon dioxide. That apparently is warming the planet, but that's yet to be shown. But we never hear that carbon dioxide actually fertilises the planet. And we've seen with satellite imagery over the last 20 years where the planet has got greener. We've also had better crop yields. It could be due to the carbon dioxide, plus better fertilisers, plus genetic engineering, etc. But we are living in the very, very best times ever to be a human on planet Earth. And so we've seen huge changes in energy. The carbon dioxide argument was then the way to move into so-called renewable energies. And if you can get rid of combustion of coal or hydrocarbons and keep nuclear on the shelf all the time, then you need another form of energy, be it tidal, which was a failure, be it wind, which is also a failure. And with wind, the amount of energy to make turbines is far greater than they'll ever produce. And then you're left with a huge mess to clean up. Those turbines release some extraordinarily dangerous chemicals. They don't get recycled. They get buried and these chemicals leach out. With solar panels, they also have a short life. They also release some toxins. They don't get recycled. They get buried. And again, the amount of energy used to make solar panels is more than they'll ever produce in their working life. So what we've done then is, because it's a clean and green and morally important, we have subsidised this energy. And this is a massive scam. We have subsidised renewable energy to the point where it's a wonderful business to get into. You don't care about the environment. You don't care about slicing and dicing all the birds and bats. You don't care about all the land that's been cleared to put in these wind turbines or solar panels. It is all about making money out of subsidies. And every person on this call is paying for it. You're paying for it in any building materials. You're paying for it in your electricity bill. You're paying for it in every single consumable you deal with. You are paying for increased energy costs. And so the change has been where we've allowed the carpetbaggers to come in and to be subsidised. Now, all of the, or pretty well all of the solar panels are made in China, and pretty well all of the wind turbines are made in China. So we've now got our energy system where we are dependent upon China for our energy system. And to make it worse, many of our power systems are actually owned by a foreign country. And to me, that presents us with a huge sovereign risk. Not only have we got higher cost energy, the energy is more unreliable. We've had to back it up with useless things like batteries, and a huge amount of our wind and solar power is backed up by diesel gensets. So the whole aim of the exercise seems to have been destroyed. But by going down this path, we are losing our freedoms, we are losing money, and we are losing our sovereignty. And that, to me, is very dangerous.
And the West is doing this, Ian, while on average China is building one or more coal-fired power stations a week. How do we justify that difference between what we are doing and what China is doing?
Well, we can't. There's absolutely no way you can justify that. He can hear Chinese laughter all over Australia. We have been so stupid. We have been stupid. We've got rid of cheap, reliable energy. We've got rid of a lot of our coal-fired power stations. We've got 24 left, yet we send China coal, we send much of Asia coal and India coal. You can hear the laughter from miles away. We have been so stupid because we wanted to show that we're morally superior and we're taking the right moral path. Now, China doesn't care. They want to do what the US did, what the UK did, and what Europe did, and that is have a booming industrial economy. And what has happened in China as a result of coal is absolutely remarkable. We've had hundreds of millions of people dragged out of gripping poverty into the middle class. And so while China is growing its middle class using coal, our middle class is being attacked. And every aspect is being attacked. And eventually we will end up with the peasants and the elite. So China's going from that situation to the exact opposite. It was coal that gave us the comfort of our life. It was coal that has kept us warm. It was coal that's given us the ability to travel, to be able to smelt metals, to be able to make cement and concrete. It was coal that has given us the greatest leg up. 200, 300 years ago, we were miserable peasants and there was absolutely no way out of it. Coal has been able to give us a way to grow as a person, as a society, and as an economy.
In Green Murder, you discuss extensively the renewable energy experience of Europe. You know Europe very well. What has been the experience of countries that have decarbonised even further than Australia? What's been the experience in countries such as the UK and Germany, Ian?
Well, it's been an absolute disaster. People have had to make the choice between freezing or eating. We have in Germany, which has had a love affair with its forests for 1,000 years. We've had forests now cleared to put in wind facilities. We have now people who can't afford electricity in Germany and are going foraging in the forests for wood so they can keep warm and so they can cook. We've had hundreds of thousands of people in Germany have their power cut off because they can't afford to pay. Germany has huge coal resources. Germany had a nuclear industry. Germany used to produce very, very cheap energy, and that's why they could have a booming industrial economy. And your future BMW or Audi or Trabant, if you want one of those, may well not be built in Germany. It might be built in Cambodia in the future where there's cheaper energy. So it's been a massive own goal for Germany. Now, to make matters worse, Germany now is making itself dependent upon Mr. Putin and the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline coming direct from Russia into Germany. It avoids Poland, it avoids the Ukraine. Now, the whole survival of the German economy now is in the hands of the Russians. How stupid is that? And the UK has done the same. The UK has relied on offshore wind power, which is extraordinarily expensive. The offshore turbines don't last very long. There's not too much solar in the UK. And they have gone down the path of renewables. They've closed off some of their nuclear power stations. They've closed off their coal-fired power stations. The UK has got a huge amount of coal. And what makes it even more interesting is that in the North Sea, where the UK once was a big oil producer, there is a massive amount of gas and oil waiting there to be taken out by fracking. And the UK is not doing this. So again, they've gone down the green path and people in the UK are freezing to death. That happened last winter. It'll happen again this winter. It happened in Germany. And the UK, again, is dependent upon power lines coming across from France that go across the English Channel, power lines coming from Ireland. They're dependent upon gas. Now, the gas price has gone through the roof and it's still going to go up because there's a great shortage. Basically, you've got to take gas when you've got it. You can't store huge amounts of gas, yet you can store a lot of energy in coal or in nuclear. So we've seen the situation in Germany, we've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in California, we've seen it in Texas, where there's a huge amount of oil and gas. Yet Texas had 200 people die fairly recently from a renewables failure. There was a big high pressure system right over Texas. Nothing happened. There was no wind. Everything froze up. And they didn't have the electricity to actually have the heaters on to be able to release the ice from the turbines. So we've got 4 very good examples of how renewables kill people and how renewables are absolutely hopeless for an industrial economy. And we are wanting to go down that path. Now, as I say in the book, no. And I remind people that they vote. And we all have a duty then to ask the candidates their views on where our energy system is going to go. We have elections coming up. It's about time we made politicians frightened, because the only good politician is a frightened politician.
And I'm going to come back to politics in a moment. Ian, you mentioned nuclear. Many people have asked me to ask you your views on the future of nuclear energy in the world and in particular in Australia.
We have the foundations at Jervis Bay that were poured in, I think, 1969 for, I think it was a 560 megawatt nuclear power station. We didn't go ahead. If we had have, we would have been with all the other G20 countries as a nuclear power generator. We didn't go that path. We're the only one. And we are the perfect country for huge nuclear reactors, which we can then send down our existing power lines to our industrial centres. And this means you've got reliable power for at least 70 years. We also sell about 6,000 tonnes of uranium in yellowcake abroad, and we don't use it. So we have wonderful opportunities for a nuclear industry in Australia. We also have wonderful opportunities, instead of using gensets or gas turbine generators in isolated towns and mines, to use these small modular reactors. And when a mine closes after, say, a 25-year life, you can put it on a couple of trailers and take it to somewhere else. So I think we've missed the boat. We've missed the boat with nuclear. And if you are green and if you object to coal, you must be a very, very strong supporter of nuclear. You can't have it both ways. Yet we see the Greens wanting to murder our economy because they don't want nuclear, they don't want coal, they don't want anything petroleum-based. And they are then left, I think, with being hypocrites and showing the political nature of their campaigns. So I'm a very strong supporter of nuclear, and I would support it to the point of saying we should have a cradle-to-grave industry. We should be, from yellowcake, producing a fuel rods, which we lease out, and then we're paid to reprocess those, to lease them out again, and we're paid eventually to put the waste material somewhere safe. Now, we've got a number of very deep mines where we could put that. We could put it as fill in a uranium mine, such as Olympic Dam. We could put it in very deep mines, which have got stable geology around them and areas where you can have easy access. And I can think of places like Mount Isa or Broken Hill or Radium Hill, plenty of places. I've got a station west of Broken Hill with 34 old mines there. I'm very happy to have a reactor and store stuff in the old mines there because those rocks are stable.
In your view, Ian, what would it take for Australia to develop a nuclear industry? Is it political leadership?
I think
it's an energy crisis? Is it something else?
I think it takes an energy crisis combined with political leadership. And I hope that if there's a change of government in South Australia, that the Labor government, who are fairly pro-nuclear, would combine and start something in South Australia. You then have to get Commonwealth agreement. But I think the greatest chance is for it to start in South Australia with a Labor government. Now, we hear Liberal Prime Ministers and Premiers say, oh, no, I can't do it. We need a bipartisan view. Well, to me, that's saying I'm not a leader. And I've had the Premier of South Australia tell me that eye to eye. And I suspect that many of his people on the other side of the House have a different view. They would go nuclear. And that would be absolutely perfect for certain parts of Australia.
Can I then ask you about another energy source that, again, many people have asked me to ask you about, the questions have come in. What is the future of hydrogen as an energy source, Ian?
Well, if you'd asked me this question 100 years ago, I'd give you exactly the same answer. The future is looking very bleak. Now, we can't mine hydrogen anywhere. We have to make hydrogen. And if we go into space and look back at Earth, we can see emissions of hydrogen coming from the planet. And that's because hydrogen is diffusing from deep in the Earth, goes right through solid rock, and it comes out through the atmosphere and goes into space. The other source of hydrogen are from chemical reactions taking place with seawater reacting with rocks deep in the ocean floor. So we don't have deposits of hydrogen. So what we have to do is we've got to make it. And there are various ways of making it. We can make it from natural gas. We can make it from coals. We can make it from water. And the method which all of us should know from school is if we electrocute pure water, we need 9 litres of that water to give us 1 kilogram of hydrogen. Now, we're a country with not much water. I think there's a better use for our water. So that process is very expensive. And I saw an analysis yesterday showing that if you go through the whole process of subsidised renewables, to then electrocute water, to then collect the hydrogen, to burn in a turbine to give you electricity, it's about 19% efficiency. And what we don't consider is that hydrogen is an extraordinarily small atom, and it will move through solids. It'll move through any steel piping that we're trying to transport it in. It will move through any truck that we're trying to carry it in. And we've got to store this hydrogen at 700 times atmospheric pressure and minus 253 degrees Celsius. To do that, you have to have huge amounts of energy, and you have these massive incendiary bombs on our roads, far worse than carrying ammonium nitrate or any other explosive we carry around. The chances of a disaster are very, very high. So when various people will sprout about having a hydrogen hub, they've forgotten one more word. It should be a Hindenburg hydrogen hub. Hydrogen is incredibly explosive. It's very hard to store. It's material you don't want to handle, and to make it is very expensive. It was tried in the 20s and it failed. So I see no reason that we should try it again. The economics hasn't changed. It's just too expensive and too dangerous.
Can I go on to then, Ian, some of the questions that have been sent in? Many questions talk about your bravery and your honesty. Why are there not more people speaking up? What are they afraid of? Are they afraid of what has happened to you, what has happened to Peter Reid, what happened to Bob Carter? Why are more people not speaking up?
Well, I think that's right. Once you step out of line, you become the easy target. And I have had 30 years of being attacked in my university life. My last university appointment was in 2011. And that is part of the course. We are going against the political mainstream. We are actually going against those who might win research grants. I'm not so sure it's bravery. It's a case of calling it as it is. And if the system is obviously fraudulent, if the scientists are clearly contradicting validated science, then it has to be called out. And that's why the way science works. It works by discussion. It works by argument. But on some treasured issues, if you argue against the fad of the day, then you get pilloried. Now, it's water off a duck's back to me. I really don't care. And I spent a lot of my time in rural and regional and outback Australia. And these real people there don't share the view of the city-based Greens. They don't share the view of the city-based scientists who are coming up with monumental findings, how humans are destroying the planet. These people out back are great observers. They've listened to the grandfather. They've got rainfall records. They've got temperature records. They know that there are cycles. They know that we humans are not having a catastrophic climate change, and we're not creating it. So I think we have a number of problems here. Scientists are dependent upon research monies. Pretty well all science is done in the cities. Most people living in the cities, especially the Greens, long ago lost contact with the bush. They yearn for the open spaces, and so they become green. Well, my solution to that is get your shotgun, go out bush and shoot every feral animal you can find, and then you'll be doing some good for the planet. So, yes, I've had a lot of criticism, but I don't really care.
How long will this debate about climate change continue for? So many questions raise the point that this seems to have been a discussion of the last 30 years. How long before we get more people reading Green Murder? How long before we get more politicians reading Green Murder and looking at the evidence and coming to understand we can't continue on the path we are on?
Well, politicians haven't got time to read books. Greens don't read books. Most journalists, especially with the ABC, they haven't read a book for years. So a book is not going to do much good, but I write these books such that there's something in the shelf where you can go and pick out a book and say, oh yes, right. So I try to write a reference book. I think we will get a change, and the change unfortunately will be if and when we have massive inflation, and I suspect that's on its way, when we cannot afford to pay our electricity bills, yet we vote. I think a financial catastrophe, something far worse than the global financial crisis, might have an effect, and perhaps a war might have an effect. And I hope none of these three scenarios happens. But I suspect when we have a financial crisis, those of us that pay our bills and those of us that vote say, well, wait a minute, we got this wrong. So I don't think the politicians have got the ear to the ground. I don't think they listen to the jungle drums. They certainly don't get a good advice, and the advisors are people who have no knowledge of the way the average person thinks. And that's why there's absolute shock horror when there's a change at an election that wasn't predicted, because people aren't listening. And out there, people are in pain, but there will be more pain if we keep going down this path. What we need is a large amount of cheap, reliable energy, which creates jobs, which creates stability, and doesn't give us pain. But we're putting ourselves in a position now where we have absolutely no buffer for any hiccup, inflation, a financial crisis, or some sort of war.
You're a renowned educator, great communicator. As I mentioned, professor. How do we communicate some of these realities to young people? We have an education system that teaches aspects of climate change in nearly every single subject. We have a deeply pessimistic, nihilistic view that's presented to young people. How do we talk about these things to the next generation?
Well, I've always found it very easy. For some years, I took a group of 40 16-year-olds into the outback and taught them how to read the land. And you can read the land and see old land surfaces that were once tropical. You can see areas where you once had ice, and on top of that, rocks that were tropical. And they put it together. They realised that they've been fed a lot of codswallop at school. Now, I'm only one, and you're fighting tens of thousands of teachers and hundreds of thousands of students. But you can by letting people work it out for themselves. But I think we've had the long march through our education system, and that happened in the 60s, and we have now lost every major institution in this country. We've lost the universities, we've lost the public service where they don't give fearless advice. It's very politicised. We've lost politically, we've lost in the universities. Every institution, like the churches, the police, everything is attacked. And this goes hand in hand with the attack on Western civilization, because the scientific method that we use to try to find the truth, we never find it, but we get closer to it, is a method that's been around for 2,500 years. Now, that's not taught any longer. Kids are not taught to measure things. And most importantly, they're not taught to think critically or analytically. And the very best course I ever did as a young person was a course in English literature, taught by a lady called Leonie Kramer, later Dame Leonie Kramer. And as a science student, I was forced to read a novel every week and to discuss it. And that taught me how to think critically. So I think reading is an extremely important thing for young people to do. But I think we've probably lost the battle in the schools until again, we have an economic crisis and we have to completely rejig our education system. We have kids coming out now that can't read or write. We have kids coming out now that don't know cursive writing. Our education standards keep slipping while we're putting more money into the education system. There's something fundamentally wrong. And I think, again, we can only reverse that when there's no hope for kids coming out of school. There are no jobs, there's no nothing. And that's got to be driven hard, again, by those of us that vote.
One of the things you talk about in the book is the measures of progress, the measures of how energy, the scientific method have advanced us. What are the issues we should be focused on? What are the issues young people should be marching in the streets about?
I think they should be marching in the streets, protecting our freedom, our prosperity, and our sovereignty, and our environment. And the environmental issue that I raise in the book that the young people should look at is actually plastics in the ocean, the use of plastics. And we are so comfortable that kids now get transported in these great caravans of SUVs down to their schools. These kids have no idea about walking to school in the rain. These kids have no idea about reality. They have to have a cause because they're idealistic. And I think the cause would be an international cause. The fight against poverty is, of course, related to energy. The cheaper and more reliable the energy is, the less poverty we have. We've seen that over hundreds of years. So for me, that would be the piece of glue that would get the kids out in the street to fight. And this brings a personal responsibility onto them. Young kids today don't walk out of a room and turn the light off. They expect to be driven here, there and everywhere. They expect to go on holidays in an aeroplane. Now, that didn't happen 50 years ago. It didn't happen 100 years ago. They use so much energy and are so indulged that they need to point the bone at places they haven't been to and don't understand, like farms, like mines. They need a better cause, and the cause, I think, will be for them to lead by example and use less plastic. As a kid, we used to collect old nuts and bolts and string and pieces of wood. We never threw anything out. And we were the ultimate recyclers. Kids have to learn that they are massive consumers, and that comes with consequences.
We have a few moments left for some final questions, and then I'll ask you to bring together some thoughts on the book. Talked about the future of Australia a little bit. What is the future of Australia, Ian, if we don't change course? And what can the future be if we do change course?
Well, let's start by being positive. If we do change course, and this would be assisted by being a nuclear Australia, we would be extraordinarily wealthy, and we could address many of the problems which some of us worry about. If we don't, then we go the other direction. We become poor, we have a greater division in society, and we end up with the peasants and the elite. So I think we're right at the crossroads now. And when we have that division, we lose our freedoms and we lose our sovereignty.
Where do you see hope in politics at the moment in the political process? So we talked about nuclear energy would be a political decision of a state government. As you know politics and political economy well, where do you see glimmers of hope for an understanding of what Australia could be into the future?
I see glimmers of hope with some lower house and upper house members in both state and federal politics who are prepared to stand up, speak, cross the floor. We don't have that in the Labor Party because since 1890 they've had a system where you can't do that. But privately, I know the views of many of the Labor members, and that does give me hope. It depends upon what happens in caucus. I think what's happened in the last 100 years is that people of my age who are comfortable and can afford to give back to society, we don't go into politics, but we did 100 years ago. What we get now are union lawyers or party hacks or staffers, all of whom have got no life experience, treat politics as a career. And what would change it is if we can think of politics as a calling rather than as a career. And then we might have, I think, a higher quality of decision making. At present, I think many of the people on this call would be wondering who they're going to vote for. And clearly minor parties comes to mind because there are a lot of disenfranchised people out there.
Can I ask you, Ian, as we conclude a wonderful discussion, what are some of the key things you would like the readers of Green Murder to take away, and the key things you would like them to talk to their family and friends about coming from the book?
Green politics is bankrupting, and green policies such as management of forests ends up in wildlife and trees getting killed, people losing their whole life savings in their station or their houses. Green politics with wind and solar ends up killing wildlife, ends up destroying the land, ends up putting toxins into the soils and the waterways. Electric vehicles. We tried them in 1806. They didn't work then. They still don't tick all the boxes economically. But if you have an electric vehicle, you have to think of where the commodities for this vehicle come from. You use a lot more material in an electric vehicle than you do in a normal internal combustion driven vehicle. And in an electric vehicle, we use nickel, and most of the world's nickel comes from clear felling of tropical forests and taking out the bottom horizon of the soil, and often that's left in such a mess. And the cobalt for your electric vehicle comes from black child slave labour working underground in mines in the Congo. So if you want to prance around saying how morally great you are driving this electric vehicle, then you need to be reminded that you are supporting slave labour. And one of the aims of this book was to attack the morality of the Greens, and which is why I called it Green Murder. Green policies end up in impoverishment and death, whereas capitalism ends up in everyone having an equal opportunity and thriving.
Ian, congratulations on Green Murder. Congratulations on what you're doing for Australia. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who has been with us on this episode of IPA Encounters. That includes our discussion. Thank you.